I've always said that when horror games are at their best, no other genre can even come close to how gripping and memorable they are. As one of the first true examples of what we would call a horror video game, Clock Tower on the Super Famicom sowed the seeds from which games like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and others would eventually emerge to turn this scrappy experimental genre into one of gaming's most popular categories. The PS1 sequel, which was my first real horror game, single-handedly made me a Clock Tower and survival horror fan for life. And since then, the series would only technically spawn 4 games total, the most recent of which would release on the PS2 all the way back in 2003, well over 2 decades ago, which in video game years basically means Clock Tower is about as dead as it gets. That might finally be turning around though. As I predicted in a rather old and bad video that I made a long time ago, don't watch it, a Clock Tower game is finally getting a modernized iteration. So in honor of that, I think now's about as good a time as any to cross off one of my bucket list video ideas and review every game in the Clock Tower series, and then give sort of a final verdict on the series as a whole, and give my thoughts on where I think the franchise could go from here, or if it even should go from here. The original Clock Tower released as a late Super Famicom title in 1995 from Human Entertainment. And though it would get a more definitive version on the PlayStation 1 and the WonderSwan of all things, it would never officially get a North American version, at least prior to WayForward's Clock Tower Rewind. Fan-made translations are easy to come by though, including this English-patched version of the game I'm playing here. Set in the sprawling Barrows mansion, Clock Tower follows Jennifer Simpson, a young girl whose general design is not so loosely inspired by the main character from Dario Argento's Italian horror flick Phenomena, as she explores the Barrows mansion and uncovers the many mysteries of the cursed family that resides therein. The story unfolds a lot like a slasher movie, with various characters turning up dead, while the main heroine gets closer to understanding the villain and eventually finding a way to defeat him. You control Jennifer with point-and-click gameplay, not all that different from Myst and other adventure games that were gaining traction in the computer gaming space at the time. Most of what you'll be doing is reading dialogue and solving puzzles, but with the occasional encounter with Scissor Man to throw you off. This villain character immediately steals the show as a scissor-wielding childlike maniac that will mercilessly end anyone caught in his path. During these encounters, you generally have 2 options. Find a way to hide from Scissor Man, which is what you'll usually want to do, or you can go on the offensive and use something in the environment against him. The color behind Jennifer's face here, which the game calls her panic meter, indicates her health and general mental status. Blue is excellent, while yellow, orange, brown, and red indicate worsening states, where Jennifer's options are increasingly limited. The more altercations you have with Scissor Man and other threats, the worse off Jennifer's panic meter will become, but as time passes, it can recover. Sitting still is the best way to ensure this happens, but even then, Scissor Man can still show up, so that underlying tension is always there. I would argue Scissor Man is one of the best villains in video game history, and not just because he's very unnerving to deal with directly, but also because of his strange ability to just be sort of omnipresent. Even when he's not technically around, he's still impacting your experience. As you encounter him more and more, the game sort of trains you to always keep an eye out for objects that look like you can hide in them, or use them against Scissor Man somehow if needed. Even discovering a new area also comes with a certain amount of unease, since you're not immediately sure what your options would be if Scissor Man were to show up, which he could, and probably will. And that's the genius of him as a character and a gameplay mechanic. You can see shades of this idea in games all the way up to Amnesia and Alien Isolation, and I think they all owe a little something to Scissor Man. Like Jennifer, Scissor Man's design is also supposedly inspired by an old horror movie, but this time it's an obscure American slasher movie called The Burning, which is actually a pretty fun watch if you're into that sort of thing. Scissorman has a unique look to him that I think still makes him stand out nicely among the million other horror game villains that have emerged in the decades since. The presentation in Clock Tower is pretty great all things considered. The graphics themselves, while not mind-blowing, do look great and stay true to their very specific artistic direction. The dark blues and purples of the Barrows Mansion maintain an extremely spooky vibe that keeps you on edge, though as you unveil more areas, a larger variety of color palettes do emerge, so it doesn't get too redundant. Even rooms that you don't necessarily need to go into to progress are worth checking out, as they all have plenty of cool details and atmosphere that only elevate the game. And since it isn't a super long one, I do recommend taking your time with it and slowly soaking everything up. Some of the more important story moments and bigger scares are illustrated with particularly detailed images, some of which seem like digitized photos, though I'm not sure. They kind of remind me of the digitized images from the cutscenes of Splatterhouse 3. It's a very distinctly 16-bit era thing, and I think it works particularly well in horror games. As Jennifer unravels more of the mystery of the mansion and the monsters the Barrows family spawns every few generations, Clock Tower comes together nicely with a lot of great scares and thoughtful gameplay. The cursor changing shape to indicate when it's over something that you can interact with helps narrow down what you need to focus on, unlike a lot of horror games that came after Clock Tower that have you spamming the action button along walls and bookcases until you find the next item of importance. I also like that the sounds and the music largely avoid a lot of that muffled stuffiness that SNES games tend to have. If you're a fan of classic horror games, this is one that I highly recommend playing through at least once, if for nothing else to experience an extremely important part of horror game history. When 10-year-old me got his hands on Clock Tower for the PS1, I logically assumed it was the first game in the series, given its lack of a 2 in the title. Although I do remember noticing the large amount of backstory the game fills you in on, and the characters occasionally bringing up traumatic events from the past, which always did kind of make it feel like a part 2, but I didn't think much of it, until a few years later when I would come across information on early internet gaming forums that would set the record straight. Why they decided to skip localizing the original and just pretend that the sequel was the original is beyond me, but it would set the series up for a very confusing legacy. We'll get to that later though. For now, we're going to focus on what I think is the best game in the series, Clock Tower for the PS1, or as our friends in Japan more correctly call it, Clock Tower 2. The story here starts off like any respectable horror sequel should, with the surviving character Jennifer exploring her history with the scissor-wielding maniac who has seemingly returned and tracked her down to a quiet university district in Norway.
The Clock Tower murders are fascinating research material for me.
This game expands the story greatly with a larger cast of characters that have a lot more to say. Thankfully, they're all pretty interesting and really well written, and when there is voice acting, it's actually pretty great, in that PS1 era voice acting kind of way.
No, it sounds crazy, but it looks like they were killed with a giant pair of scissors.
So even at its driest moments, and it does have some dry moments, Clock Tower is able to keep your attention, partly because the game adds in a thick layer of a whodunit mystery to the narrative, as it becomes increasingly clear that one of the main characters is either conspiring with Scissorman or may very well be Scissorman. And as you get to know some of these characters and see how they're a little bit duplicitous and shady with each other, you can start to suspect one character over another, or several at a time. On the off chance that you haven't completed this game on your own, I won't spoil any more of it here, as it's a really fun mystery to unfurl yourself. While Jennifer is still the primary focus for most of the game, the events of the story do have you playing multiple characters. Professor Barton's opening stage makes for an interesting prologue as he obsesses over the Clock Tower case to a concerning degree and gets really defensive with reporters asking him pretty normal questions about it, while the other protagonist, Helen, who has adopted Jennifer, finds herself in Scissorman's crosshairs as well. And that drags Inspector Gotts into the fray, a longtime friend of Helen's who feels rather protective of her. Meanwhile, Nolan the reporter also strikes up a romance with Jennifer, so there's all these little interconnected relationships across the cast that make them extremely interesting and relatable and really flesh things out well. And you become even more invested in them as they're all brought together by their common threat of Scissorman as he's picking them all off one by one. And by the end, they become a pretty tightly knit group when everybody ends up back at the Barrows mansion to solve the mystery and stop Scissorman once and for all.
Everyone's waiting.
And as you can see from the footage, this game largely plays the same as the previous one. Point-and-click gameplay, lots of investigation and exploring, and of course dozens of deadly encounters with Scissorman and other haunted things across the game's handful of scenarios.
Some kind of weirdo?
The panic meter mechanic is simplified a little bit with just 3 levels this time. A white cursor meaning everything is fine, a yellow one meaning you're not doing so hot, and a red one meaning that you're on your last leg and will not survive another altercation, so hiding is your only option at this point until you heal up. Every character is subject to the same system, though they do have some small differences here and there. Like for instance, Jennifer pushes Scissorman over, like she did before, while Gotts gives him a knuckle sandwich, and Helen kicks him straight in the beanbag. Functionally, they all result in the same outcome, with Scissorman being stunned long enough for you to escape, but I appreciate the differences that fit their personalities. Each scenario generally involves a character being trapped somewhere as they search for a way to escape, and finding various items needed to unscrew vent covers, unlock doors and windows are always part of that process. But there's also usually optional items of interest that can result in better endings if you find them, and lock you out of certain things if you don't. Certain decisions you make during the dialogue sections between scenarios will also lock you in and out of certain story paths. So this is a game you're definitely going to want to play at least a few times if you want to see everything, which I highly recommend doing. There's also the fact that you're just very unlikely to see all of the little scenes and scares that pop up in each scenario if you only play through them once or twice. There's so many little Scissorman moments packed into each area that you could play through the game a dozen times and not see them all. I particularly like this one, where Scissorman's evil has seemingly taken over a bunch of computers around him. It makes no sense, and it's awesome. I love this game. Also, the infamous scene where Scissorman seemingly went through the trouble to fax you a threatening note, which is such a specifically 1997 thing to do. The sound effects and music here are a huge step up from the Super Famicom game, and even the PS1 version of that. Lots of the same themes and the music have re-emerged, though they're better here. And the Scissorman music here is brand new, and I think it's the best iteration of a being chased around by a bad guy song that the series would ever have. If you couldn't already tell, this is one of my favorite video games of all time, and I have to admit, when I realized it was the Super Famicom game getting the remake and not this one, I was a little bit disappointed. This is the better game of the two by any measure, and the extremely blocky character models could certainly use a facelift. That said, I do kind of like these graphics as the visual time capsule that they are. It's kind of like the voice acting. There's just something very specific about this era of early polygons that makes horror games hit very differently. Visuals aside, every fan of horror games should absolutely check this game out. It complements the original game perfectly with a bigger story and deeper gameplay while closing out this particular saga in epic fashion. What was called Clock Tower 2 in the US is actually a spin-off. Clock Tower Ghost Head is the original title in Japan, which does make more sense, since this game has no functional connection to the previous ones, although it does have a lot of similar story and gameplay elements. Like those previous two games, this one was also developed by Human Entertainment, and largely focuses on point-and-click adventure-style gameplay in a horror setting.
No! Oh no! Ashley!
Though none of those elements work as well in this game as they did in the previous ones, in my opinion, and pretty much everyone else's. The animations are smoother, but somehow more sluggish. The graphics are also somehow better, yet worse, and the story isn't particularly interesting.
Alyssa, you're okay.
Uncle Philip, what happened?
No time to explain now. You've got to hide.
The game was panned pretty hard by critics at the time of its release too, since the horror genre had grown a lot since the last Clock Tower, with far more impressive games like Resident Evil 2 and Parasite Eve setting the new standard. So Clock Tower 2, by comparison, really had a lot working against it right off the bat.
Oh, the line's dead.
Here we have Alyssa, a young woman who finds herself possessed by her foul-mouthed alter ego, Mr. Bates, who she is able to keep at bay with a special amulet, but if the situation calls for it, she can set the amulet down in certain spots and let Mr. Bates take over, which can change the way she interacts with certain objects and enemies, and that can lead to solutions to certain situations and even different story paths, though sometimes it's just as important to pick the amulet back up and give control back to Alyssa.
It's Alyssa's amulet.
So the whole dual personality thing is kind of a neat idea, but it's about as interesting as the game ever gets.
Alright then, let's get out of here.
The game also basically never telegraphs which personality would be a better fit for what's coming next, and that makes the game's levels feel padded out and tedious, since you'll often be inspecting everything not just once, but twice with both characters to discover everything and progress.
It says help.
It also doesn't help that the new villains that chase Alyssa around aren't nearly as scary or memorable as Scissorman, which is a trend that would sadly stick with the series from here on out, albeit to varying degrees. And you deal with these encounters roughly the same way that you dealt with them in the past, either hiding or confronting whoever's chasing you at the cost of your panic meter. Though here, Alyssa's cowardly dodge animation doesn't have nearly the impact or personality of Gotts knocking Scissorman into Last Weekend or Helen dropkicking the Barrows family jewels. Although as Mr. Bates, you can shoot stuff and kick stuff, although again, it's just not very impactful most of the time. And for whatever reason, the gun doesn't kill zombies in Chapter 2 nearly as well as Alyssa does with the broom in the ladies' bathroom. Yeah, that's great game design, yeah. But the real downside of Clock Tower 2 is that it just isn't very scary or interesting almost all of the time. Despite following the rulebook of the last game so closely, this one almost always fails to recapture that level of intrigue or tension, only coming close in a handful of isolated moments here and there.
I'm going to poke around a bit more.
The cheesy voice acting is definitely still there, but it's not as charming here as it was in the last game, and I cannot say why. I don't know, it just isn't.
That's why you're possessed. Or
I've been cursed too?
Now, all that's not to say Clock Tower 2 The Struggle Within / Ghost Head doesn't have a few things going for it. Mr. Bates himself is a rather entertaining character. He always says things in the most villainous way possible. It's so over the top and ridiculous that I end up kind of liking it.
Hey, you little shit. What good is it gonna do to burn that?
And he's certainly the most interesting character in the whole game by a country mile.
That's the way I do it.
It also retains having a bunch of different endings, so if this game does click with you for some reason, there's a similar amount of gameplay to be had here as with the previous ones. I also like the more overtly Japanese style for the story and the characters. The Western version of the game tries to change its setting to California, but it's pretty clearly in Japan, and I wish they had just leaned into that a little bit more instead of away from it. It's one of the more unique aspects of the game. Clock Tower 2 / Ghost Head is a flawed and misguided game on several levels, but it's not the dumpster fire some say it is. And it certainly plays better than some horror games of the time, like, say, Overblood, but at the end of the day, I still don't generally recommend it, unless you're a weirdo like me who just likes every game from this era.
What's happening here?
Or you're just super interested in seeing everything from the Clock Tower series. Dated gameplay, unimpressive graphics, and the complete loss of whatever recognition Scissorman and Jennifer Simpson might have been able to bring to the table, on top of the fact that even in a vacuum, this was just not a very good game, all culminated into an abject failure for Human Entertainment and the Clock Tower series as a whole. I managed to get some enjoyment out of it because of my attachment to this style and era of game, but not because it's actually good. So take that for what you will.
It's dead just as I thought.
Unfortunately, Human Entertainment would end up closing their doors for good shortly after Clock Tower 2 / Ghost Head launched, with all of their IP ending up in the hands of the highest bidder. Capcom would end up with Clock Tower, and soon would start work on a new game in the series with Sunsoft at the helm. And after a rather lengthy and expensive development cycle for the time, Clock Tower 3 would take the biggest leap forward the series ever had. Perhaps too big of a leap in some ways.
Where's the sound coming from? Who's doing that?
ditching the point-and-click gameplay entirely in favor of more contemporary real-time 3D movement seemed necessary, since that was one of the biggest complaints about the last game, though it does retain the basic structure of evading stalkers and investigating your surroundings.
Where are you? Melissa, where are you?
The graphics got a huge upgrade here, making Clock Tower 3 look well above average for its time, with a lot of motion capture, sharp textures, and large atmospheric areas. Now the mocap is quite a bit overdone a lot of the time and seems kind of at odds with the delivery style of the dialogue, but it still does give the game that sense of high production value that wasn't super common at the time.
And she said you might come back from boarding school and asked me to hand that key to you if you wasn't back in time.
She must have known I'd disobey her and come back here.
The music is also shockingly good, with an extremely well-produced score that classes up the game well and gives it some of that AAA credibility that Capcom so clearly wanted it to have, although some music choices at certain times seem pretty asinine at best. The story once again does its own thing here. There are occasional vague references to the original two games, but not what I would call actual connections to them. Some name choices, like the main character having the same name as Alyssa from Clock Tower 2, and the Burroughs Castle being very similar to the Barrows Mansion, and yet another young female heroine wearing a boarding school uniform all make it feel like a part of the series aesthetically, although it is ultimately a standalone story. Either way, here, Alyssa, much like that Alyssa, has returned home from boarding school to find her mother missing. But in her place is this dude, who seems way too comfortable putting his hands on teenage girls, and for whatever reason is only able to speak in enigmatic riddles, and is also insane. I don't really recommend trying to make too much sense of Clock Tower 3's story beyond this point though, as it only gets more ridiculous from here.
My birthday?
See, even after all this time, I still remember.
To oversimplify it a lot, Alyssa basically discovers that she's a part of a long line of spirit guides/exorcists, and she now has to find items of importance to get rid of ghosts and battle with serial killers with her magical bow. More on that in a bit. After one of the most horrifying things I've ever witnessed in a video game, Clock Tower 3 truly starts with a familiar situation as a marauding killer stalks your character as you hide and use your environment to your advantage. Though instead of escaping being the goal, Clock Tower 3's levels involve surviving a handful of encounters with the killer at hand so you can discover their weaknesses and ultimately fight them. The panic meter mechanic has changed quite a bit here, and I think it's ultimately for the better, as it is an actual meter this time that fills up when killers get close and/or attack you, and when other scary stuff happens. If the meter fills all the way up, Alyssa basically melts down and starts panicking, which results in her losing her balance, freezing up, and not being able to do simple commands. The screen also gets blurry, and the controller will vibrate incessantly, so it works pretty well in making you feel as disoriented as you likely would if you were in her shoes. In true survival horror fashion though, you have items to help you out. Alyssa can drink potions to calm down and wear invisibility bands to become invisible for an extremely short amount of time. I don't find these particularly useful since they wear off so fast, although if you use 2 or 3 of them in a row while also walking away from the enemy, you can create enough distance that they lose interest and go away. Not a super reliable method, but it can work with a little bit of luck. She can also throw holy water on bad guys to stun them for a little bit, which works a lot more reliably but usually doesn't end an actual encounter. It just gets you out of a pinch. I do like the additions of these items, since they make the game feel more like a traditional survival horror experience, and they give you a little bit more flexibility without making you feel too powerful. After collecting enough artifacts related to the killer chasing you around, you'll end up in a boss fight with them using a magic bow that appears out of nowhere and changes the gameplay entirely. Here you'll run around avoiding their attacks while squeezing out shots with the bow. Each arrow deals more damage the longer you're able to charge it. But the real goal is to land fully charged ones to chain them down from several different directions. Once they're sufficiently pinned, Alyssa can deal a major blow causing either massive damage or taking them out entirely. These battles can be a little bit tedious, and they feel about as random to do as it sounds, but I guess it all works well enough for what it is.
Prepare to die!
Afterwards, the cycle begins again with a different killer in a different environment, while Alyssa's story also moves forward. Although that story tends to create more questions than answers, with an increasingly incomprehensible mishmash of concepts, like time travel, ghosts, characters possessing each other, and various fantasy elements that feel more like something you'd see in a JRPG than a horror game. As much as I tend to enjoy weird and off-the-wall stories, I can't say I'm in love with this one. It did grow on me a little bit more as the game went along, and I do like Alyssa as a character quite a bit, but I don't know. The narrative here never totally comes together for me as anything particularly good or coherent. It's got a lot of good voice acting and is generally well executed, but it's just a little bit too silly for me to get invested in it. The gameplay's great though, as whiplash-inducing as it can be when it switches from being a pretty good survival horror game to those bizarre boss battles. A real gripe I have with the game though is that the level layouts are very constricted compared to the previous games. You can certainly wander around freely to some extent, but these areas are pretty linear and feel rather small compared to the large buildings with dozens of rooms that populate the previous games. Hiding spots and defensive items are severely limited as a result of that too, and most of them aren't reusable. So you can easily end up in situations where you're just looping around the levels trying to shake the pursuer out of sheer luck, or spamming your invisibility bands until they lose interest. I can understand them wanting to turn Clock Tower into a more contemporary survival horror game, but these levels just needed more options for it to really work better. I'm also not a big fan of the combination of fixed camera angles and 3D controls. To me, if you're gonna have fixed camera angles, tank controls actually work better. I know this game came out when developers were still trying to balance out those two ideas in horror games, so I cut it some slack for that, but either way, it's something worth mentioning. Overall, I think there's a good case to be made for this game. Not all of its ideas work, but a lot of them do, and I always have at least some respect for a game that tries new things, even if all of those things don't quite land. Clock Tower 3 seems a little bit underrated to me too, as I think it holds up better than a lot of other PS2-era horror games that people talk about a lot more. Sunsoft did a great job here with high production values across the board and a story that, while totally ridiculous, is at least entertaining.
Alicia, this is no longer your home. This is the dark realm where I rule.
I don't necessarily feel like they had to go in such a radically different direction for the third game, but they did a good enough job with it that I don't really miss the old style while playing it. Clock Tower 3 did not sell or review super well at the time of its release, but I think it's a much-needed win for the series, and generally pretty easy to recommend. The crazy mocap performances and the handful of shocking scenes make it a noteworthy horror game, but the excellent presentation and radical revamping of the Clock Tower gameplay make it a good one. Clock Tower is a series that, at least as of now, is often characterized by its wildly inconsistent results. The giant swings in quality, style, and content throughout just 4 games has left the franchise in a bit of a strange spot. I mean, at this point, what even is Clock Tower? If Capcom, WayForward, or whoever owns the IP at this point were to continue with the franchise, how should they even proceed? Should it go all the way back to adventure-style gameplay? Should it be like a first-person horror game like Amnesia or Outlast or something? To me, I feel like something that maybe plays a little bit more like Until Dawn or any of those supermassive horror games, that seems like it would be a good fit. But I would also like to see some of that open-ended stealth gameplay that we got from the remothered games. So some kind of mix between those two things would maybe be the sweet spot for me? I don't know. I'm curious what you think though. Let me know. Although I am fairly certain that at least in terms of the story, the best results are going to come from going all the way back to the only 2 characters that really matter, Scissorman and Jennifer. Now that could come in the form of a true ground-up remake of the original game, or it could be an actual sequel to the PS1 game, where maybe the next generation of the Barrows family comes after Jennifer again. Or maybe since so much time has passed, they could be coming after Jennifer and Nolan's kids. You know, it could be like one family versus another. There's an idea, there you go, Capcom. But no matter what happens, I'm really excited to get that new version of the original game in a modern format and just have that to play instead of these ROM hacks. And if that ends up being the end of Clock Tower because of what a mess it sort of is at this point, I don't know, I guess I can live with that. Lord knows we have plenty of Clock Tower successors out there and other franchises that kind of owe everything to Clock Tower that I also enjoy. And, those can sort of scratch that itch for me long term. If that's the way it goes, it's not the end of the world. Though I do have this nagging feeling, just kind of smoldering in the back of my mind, that we have not seen the last of Clock Tower.